I'm really glad you're all here with us today. This month, we're joined by our guest speaker, Jessica Hayon, who will be guiding us through a powerful conversation on navigating the unknown. It's a topic that touches all of us in different ways, and Jessica brings insight, honestly, and experience that I know will resonate with the community. You can go ahead now.
Thanks, Raj. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to be here and share my journey with you. I thought for a really long time about what to say and how to frame it with what I think is a unique story of navigating the unknown. Sorry, I'm gonna keep looking down at my notes. Not a public speaker, and it's just keeping me on track. To me, my journey seems so unique because there wasn't a defining point where my life changed go forward, but rather a slow, quiet regression. I don't remember every detail as I was a small child, but I do know that I was born meeting all the milestones that I needed to meet and developing in every way I should have been. And for whatever reason, over my young childhood years, I started to become clumsy, walked with a limp, and was getting weaker in my lower extremities. In the beginning, I remember my parents putting me in dance class, and this was at the suggestion of the pediatrician. The majority of my childhood, I actually thought that I loved dance class, and that's why I did it, not because I wasn't physically okay. It's really interesting because what really helped me throughout everything was journaling. My feelings were really big, and the things I wrote were often negative, so I would always rip up my journals after I wrote them. As I was beginning to think this through for today, I wanted to write things down in a journal, and I found one of my half-empty journals, but with pages that I forgot to rip up. There was an entry about how photographs told a different story than what was really happening. At the time, I felt betrayed by my photographs of what I thought was me happy at a recital performing my best, when in reality I was not graceful at all, and it was the beginning of my decline. At the time, I was still partaking in everything I could as any other child, but everything was getting so much harder. Over the years, the clumsiness was progressing. I was getting weaker and weaker over the next 5 or so years. I went to countless neurologists and other specialists. I'm from this area, so I had access to all the best doctors from Mount Sinai to NYU to Columbia and so on. And fortunately for me was the support and privilege of my family. They were and are always there for me no matter what. We would just hop from one doctor to the next, tests constantly coming back negative all the while. It was just so baffling to me, especially because I was losing all the abilities in my lower extremities without any explanation. I remember going to physical therapy 3 times a week. I think with insurance, you get something like 60 visits per calendar year. And once I got close to this number, the physical therapist just asked me if I even wanted to come back because I was actually getting worse. I honestly just felt really crushed by everything that was physically happening to me. And outside of trying to solve such an inexplicable condition, living it was much harder than anything I had experienced in a doctor's office. Having a spinal tap and biopsy at 12 years old that kept me out of school for over 2 weeks wasn't ideal, but probably less traumatic than losing all my physical abilities in my lower extremities. Going from walking to using crutches and finally starting to use a wheelchair just before my 13th birthday. I was in a constant state of adapting to maintain normalcy in my day-to-day life. I think it was just kind of like, this is what you need to do, so figure it out. I had to be as strong as possible because the road ahead would not be straight and would not be easy. This was over 20 years ago, so the world seemed a lot different, and there was a lot more closed-mindedness and less acceptance. At school, when I was still walking, I experienced being bullied, which was very difficult because I didn't understand how someone could make fun of me for something that I couldn't even control. Then in 7th grade, when I showed up to school in a wheelchair, I remember hearing rumors about what happened to me. It was hard enough being a teenage girl, but then to show up in a completely different condition and have to deal with people spreading rumors about me. Although I was using a wheelchair full-time at school, I was still using my crutches sometimes at home or if I went out to dinner. One time I went out to dinner with my friends and we were waiting for one of our moms to pick us up. I remember being in the parking lot and this man just yelled an ableist slur across the parking lot. I remember being really upset, but not as much as my friend. Again, I just didn't understand how someone thought it was okay to say, especially a grown adult to a teenage girl. Between being bullied, dealing with closed-mindedness, I was trying to live in a world that also wasn't physically accessible to me. And my definition of accessibility was changing every day because my physical situation was as well. What I could do one day, I couldn't do the next. One year I was in gym class running around, and the next year I was in the same class sitting out on the side. One year I'd be in camp climbing up the ladder to the zip line, and the next year I would be struggling just to walk up a hill. My parents' house has steps, and I used to be able to walk up them, but then as things were changing, I'd have to crawl up them. It kind of just was what it was, and I always had to figure out how to adapt. It has obviously formed who I am today, and I'm a very go-with-the-flow person and will figure out any situation because that was the only way for me to thrive and survive. I was very introverted and didn't have too many friends, mostly keeping to myself. To me, I was just like everyone else except I was in a seated position. I didn't see anything that it could have prevented me from going to grade school, high school, and even going away to college. I always loved fashion and was pretty creative and crafty. I took home ec in high school and learned of the sewing machine. When you see a sewing machine, there's a foot pedal on the floor that powers the machine, and you have to step to apply the pressure. Obviously, I couldn't press the foot pedal, but that's what I wanted to do, so I had to figure it out. So I took the foot pedal and I put it on the table beside me, and I would guide the fabric with my hands through the machine and use my elbow to power the machine. I was entirely unstoppable in anything that I wanted to do and didn't often give up. So naturally, because of this, for college, I went to the Fashion Institute of Technology in Midtown. And luckily for me, I was still in the tri-state area and had the comfort of knowing my parents were nearby, but I'd also be able to live on my own in the dorms on campus. I worked with the school's accessibility office to ensure all my needs were met, and I lived in the dorms across from the school for 4 years. Going away and living at school was the best thing that could have been done for my independence. It's really easy to get comfortable with someone else doing or helping you do everything. For example, growing up, I chose not to learn how to drive just because I knew I would end up in the city and wouldn't need it. Or like I said, my parents' house had steps, so I never actually did anything on my own, or at least someone knowing what I was doing. Being on my own at college was such a game changer, and this is when I was truly challenging myself. Also, an important thing to note at this time was I stopped going to doctors to find a diagnosis. I couldn't live my life if I was hung up on finding answers that may never come. It was holding me back and not letting me see who I could be. At that point, it had been around a decade of going to the doctor, so I didn't really know what could change. I was also getting the idea it could maybe be genetic, which is equally mysterious because your genes are what they are and not something you can change or correct. So back to me trying to live my life. I know it seems really small, but I remember the first time I took a train alone after graduating college. I was meeting up with friends in DC for the weekend and took Amtrak. I just had to do it. I told no one, meaning my parents, and I think they were definitely shocked. I think eventually in a good way, and they also never picked me up again and would always just tell me to take the train. It's weird to think back that I was over the age of 21 when I first took a train alone to another state. Also, 15 years ago when I was in school, I was living in a very different world than what exists today. Besides from accessibility, people's perspectives were also different, and there was a lot less inclusivity. I never understood why strangers on the street would always ask what was wrong with me and why I was in a wheelchair. And whenever I would say that I didn't know and I was not diagnosed with a condition, people always told me they had a great doctor that I should see. People would tell me if I prayed to Jesus, I would walk again. Maybe these were all just other reasons I kept to myself. I think the craziest thing that probably happened to me when I was at FIT, I was working as a student ambassador at an open house. Anyone could come in, and I was stationed at the door. A woman came up to me and asked me what was wrong with me. I would just smile and nod as she went on and on because I don't think there was anything else I could have done. She sounded like she was finishing, and she asked if she could pray for me, which I said was fine. And I thought she would go home and do that, but she meant right then and there. So she got down on the ground, held my hand, and put her head in my lap, and then started praying. It was very uncomfortable, probably the most uncomfortable I've ever been. And I really wanted someone to help. No one saw that I needed help. But then after a few minutes of praying, she had left. Like I said, I just assumed a lot of people say that they'll pray for me, and I just assumed she would go home and do so. Other situations like One time I was just on the street and someone just asked me if I needed help getting around, like for the day. He would take me wherever I wanted, to the grocery store, anything like that. Once I was volunteering at an event, and for whatever reason I said I couldn't do something, I had work, and this woman turns to me and says, "I didn't know people like you work." So I feel like that time in my life was just a string of awkward interactions that don't really happen as much anymore. I also don't know if it's attributed to the fact that we live in such an eccentric city, and I was much more out and about in random places when I was younger than I am now. The only thing I get a lot of, and I'm sure all my friends in chairs would say the same, is that if I'm ever drinking, people ask if I have a license and that I can't drive under the influence. I'm sure we've all heard this one. I guess the commentary will always exist, but it has really taught me a lot of patience. Not only being in a wheelchair, but also being in New York means to expect the unexpected. But I also wish people would know that none of these comments are actually welcomed. I'm just trying to exist in the world like everyone else. I'm not trying to be evasive, but just because my disability is visible doesn't mean it's a talking point, especially for strangers. There's a time and a place, like here. A lot of people have invisible disabilities and no one would even know it, so they would never have to talk about it. It was semi-better and less unhinged in my professional interactions. The worst I remember was going on a job interview once, and the woman I interviewed said it probably wouldn't work out because they have too many boxes in the hallway and I wouldn't fit. I checked off all the boxes to do the job, but what was stopping me was the fact that they had so many boxes in the hallway, which was probably a fire hazard anyway. This was one of my first job interviews, and I had no confidence and also couldn't stand up for what is right. So I think I just said okay and left. At one of my jobs, the owner of the company asked me how I fit under the desks. This was an improvement, but I'm glad HR has a better handle on accessibility and accommodations. Whenever I interview, I personally choose not to disclose my disability, as I don't want any preconceived notions. So before my first in-person interview, I would either do a Google Street View or I would try to go past it in person. The more corporate the company was, the better the accommodations were. Early on, I was at a job that actually asked me if I wanted to come in the week before to make sure my setup was workable. And I always thought this was such a great idea, and I always requested it at all my jobs after. Another aspect to life after college was an apartment. So after college, my parents helped me with an apartment because I really struggled to find someplace accessible enough for me. I can't even tell you the amount of apartments I toured that I couldn't actually fit in, or because there were steps, or I couldn't even turn my chair around, or there would just be like a random step to go to the bathroom. But even with New York being so inaccessible, there are so many options that it became accessible enough for me. Just like how as time went on, delivery became more common and it was much easier to get things like my groceries delivered than to struggle with bags wrapped around me rolling back from the store. After college, and once I was all settled into my living and work situation, I felt a little stuck and alone in my head, like something was missing. I made it through all the obstacles and got the achievements. I graduated school, got an apartment, got a full-time job, but I completely ignored the social aspect to my life. I never really felt like I could connect with people because I just thought I was too different. This was probably also due to the fact that I didn't have any other friends with disabilities, and I felt like me being in a wheelchair was the elephant in the room. Coworkers would invite me to happy hour, and I would get there to find stairs to get into the restaurant, and they would feel bad, and they didn't check, and they would say they would carry me up, or I would get there and the bathroom would be downstairs, there'd be no elevator, which meant I couldn't actually drink anything because then I'd have to go to the bathroom. But again, as time went on, things got better on the whole. I don't know if this meant people were being more considerate and checking beforehand, or more places were becoming accessible, or a combination of the two. But people and accessibility overall could be completely hit or miss. I very recently had to deal with someone constantly using the accessible bathroom stall at work. After 4 or 5 times of me waiting for the stall on the same person, I asked them if they could stop using that stall. There were like 4 other stalls, and their response was, "But it's my favorite stall." I'm not gonna lie, I was very speechless after they said that. And also very oddly, like a few months later, it happened again, but with a different person. And they had the exact same response, that it was their favorite stall. So I think that's why it's just really important to be relaxed and patient, because I will never not run into these situations. So about a year into the working world, I went on to what was a very transformational trip for me. It was a group trip meant for people with mobility challenges. I could have never imagined a trip without a single accessibility concern, because everyone had the same general needs. It was also a highly active trip, so I was exposed to a whole new world. Who knew things like adaptive sailing and adaptive cycling even existed? It was such an eye-opening trip that when I got back, my first search was how I could hand cycle in New York. Through my search, I found Achilles International, which is such an amazing organization, helping people with disabilities explore athletic endeavors. Hand cycling quickly became my new favorite activity. I started to participate in local races and even traveling to participate in races all over. I've probably done 20 marathons, New York, Boston, Chicago, LA, Disney, and so on. I was even really excited when I had the opportunity to go to Colombia to participate in a half marathon. I always wanted to level up and keep challenging myself, and last year I started to do a few triathlons, which are no joke. And it's not just the physicality of having to complete each of the disciplines, but getting between each is another discipline. First, I would have to get carried into the water. Once in the water, I only had half my body to swim with. Then someone would have to carry me back out of the water, help me in my chair so I can get to my bike. After my bike ride, I'd have to come back and someone would have to help me get out of my bike, into my chair, and then into the racing chair. So not only is this strenuous as a sport, but I'd have the pain from either the way I was sitting on my legs or I was overheating and getting spasms. But I'm me, so of course I kept signing up for a new one. Also, the community I found was so amazing because I finally felt like I was at home. Everyone I met has been so warm and inviting and always wants to help and support one another. I always felt comfortable with everyone instantly. It really makes a difference when you're with someone who deals with the same and similar daily situations. Obviously, I'm not anti-able-bodied people, but it was nice to finally have a balance in my life. People who understood things I was going through, things I could never say to an able-bodied person because they would feel uncomfortable or not understand. Overall, I found so many different organizations that catered to people like me and was constantly growing my community while also showing myself what I was capable of. Over the years, I've explored everything from skiing to tennis to rock climbing and so on. Again, I always want to try everything and constantly challenge myself. I'm a very determined and self-disciplined person and always need to know I tried my best at everything. So when I started cycling, I decided to go to the gym to build my strength. I changed my diet. And naturally, this just helped build confidence in my life. It's interesting to note that sports were never my thing and I was not into them at all growing up. But being athletic is what helped me gain confidence. I also think it was me proving to myself that I could still do things while feeling so limited and constantly challenged physically. During the days, I was killing it at work. I was getting promoted every few years. I was just climbing the corporate ladder. I guess my confidence was so high at my last job that I even had enough courage to ask for a raise and a promotion. Not only was it hard as a female in the workplace, but then throw disabled on top of that. But again, these were just more fears and challenges, just like I was getting over my whole life, to achieve growth. I'm now a senior manager in textile research and development at an apparel company. Looking back at everything, the only thing I can say is always go for what you want, stay true to yourself, and don't let anything get in the way. Always challenge yourself, otherwise, once you get too comfortable, you won't progress. But back to my medical situation for a minute. During this time, I had to establish some sort of network of doctors so that I could seek out either medical treatment or therapy for symptoms of my undiagnosed disability, such as spasticity, or to help have access to get a new wheelchair that properly fit. All this was learned through my community. There's no way I could have ever known how to do this on my own. I was very observant and saw and always asked what others had, so I knew what was right for me and what I needed to get. Another interesting medical complication that came about 8 years ago was that my older brother started having problems walking as an adult, and he reached out to see if we could go to the doctor together. I'm going to be very honest and let you know that I was not receptive to this idea at all. I really felt for him, I really, really did, but I couldn't restart this journey. I think I thought it was like sucking me back into something that I tried really hard to put behind me. Even though I didn't want anything to do with it, I ended up at a neurogeneticist and had sequencing panels sent out, but again, no definitive answer. After 7 years, this same neurogeneticist reached out to me and asked me if I developed any new symptoms and if I wanted to do a neurological exam. At this point in my life, so much time had passed, and it's weird to say, but I felt so removed from the situation. I knew I wouldn't get hung up on it and read into anything they were asking. I knew I could go to this appointment and just move on because nothing would come of it, which is exactly what happened. Recently, it was suggested that there could be something wrong with my heart based on a genetic condition that I could potentially have, even though my genetic panel wasn't definitive. But I humored them. I went to the cardiologist. I had an echocardiogram, and again, nothing was wrong. So, unless I have a glaring new symptom or a massive medical crisis, I have no inclination to see any doctors or for a diagnosis, or at this point, anything related to my undiagnosed condition. A few years back, I tried to go to physical therapy to maintain my range of motion. And like I said, my only goal was to maintain. And so I was really upset when my physical therapist asked me why I was coming if I wasn't getting better. I'm not interested in going down this rabbit hole and having to re-deal with similar situations from my childhood that were so difficult for me. The unknown can be scary, but the known could be too. So at this point, it doesn't make a difference to me. What makes a difference to me is knowing that I'm the best version of me that I can be, and I'm living my best life. Thank you.
I can come around to you if anybody has any questions or comments.
Okay, thank you so much, Jessica. I'm curious, I'm sure you're aware as somebody with a very visible disability, and I maybe you addressed this in the beginning of your talk and I missed it, but that when you walk into a room, rather than people saying, like, what can she do? They're often saying, what can't she do? And I'm curious how you navigate that, and also how you navigate being taken seriously in your job and in your life with your very humorous approach. Thank you.
Thanks, Kennedy. Thanks for coming. I don't know, like, I said it a lot, and not to keep going back to it, but like, confidence is so important. Because like, I know who I am, and I know what I need, and I know how to handle myself. So if I go into a room, if I need help from someone, I'll ask them. If I don't, I won't. I won't expect someone to come up to me. It's not like I'm waiting for someone to come up to me. I won't show up someplace if I know I'm not gonna be okay. I just always, I don't know, it's just like how I've learned to handle myself and how I conduct myself. And even in the workplace, I'll definitely get people, because I'm usually the only one in a wheelchair. There's no one really ever else at work with a physical disability. And it is uncomfortable, and because people don't know how to act, I would say. But as long as I'm confident and comfortable with myself, I can redirect the situation and let people know what I need and what I don't need.
Any other questions or comments?
I know, Jessica, you shared with me before, so I know that you don't want to know your disability right now, but why don't you want to know your disability?
So at this point, it's been over 20 years of not knowing, so I don't really see what difference that would make in my life right now. I don't know how else to say it. It wouldn't affect me in any way. If I went to a doctor tomorrow and they said, this is what's wrong with you, I would just say, okay, and then leave, right? Like, I don't know. I don't, so like it's just harder if you get hung up on it. If you can't, oh no, I can't do this because this might be wrong or this might happen to me, and I don't want to think that.
Okay. I'm curious, if often, being the only person with a physical disability or the only person in a wheelchair, if you have ever found yourself called upon as like the token person with disabilities and therefore asked to represent sort of all accommodations that could possibly be needed and asked to be the expert on that. And if so, what did you do? How did you handle that?
So I would say absolutely yes to that question. And I think I also sometimes used it to my advantage. Sometimes, like at work you do your job, but then sometimes maybe there are extra things like being part of accessibility and things like that, and no one else is really signing up for it. So if I'm like, well, I do this every day and I help with that, I use it to my advantage because it also made me look better. So something that was just second nature to me was something that was an added bonus at work.
With your current perspective and all of the experiences that you've acquired so far, is there anything that you would tell your like 5 or 6 year old self in hindsight? And is there anything that you wish that you had implemented earlier or throughout your childhood that would have, I don't know, shifted your perspective earlier?
That's a really good question. I actually never really thought about that. But if I'm thinking now, I don't think there would be anything to say. Because like, as I shared, it was just so confusing and things were different like every day. So there isn't one thing where I'm like, this is gonna happen, you should have done this or X, Y, Z. And like I said, when I was younger, I went to physical therapy. Like I did all the things that you would think a person would do to get better or at least maintain, and it actually didn't. So it was just a digression that I couldn't have expected.
Any other questions?
All right, I just want to say thank you for everyone for coming. We have a QR code I need everyone to scan. Kat has it right there in the back. Please scan it or you will not get to leave. That's all I got to say. And thank you again, Jessica.
Thanks, Raj. Thanks, everybody.
Wait, I have one final question. Since you said this was your first talk, you're not a public speaker, would you do it again?
Sure. I think so, yes. Yeah.
Thanks so much for sharing.